People logged in, so very warm welcome. I think we should make a start. There may be one or two more will join us as we go along, but that's fine. So my name's Andrew Thinn, speaking to you from just outside Inverness tonight. I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, and with me I've got two other commissioners and one senior member of staff. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves first, because I think it's helpful for you to hear direct from them. So Lorne, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, good evening everybody. My name's Lorne MacLeod. I'm based in Oban. I'm one of the land commissioners. I'm also a chartered accountant, and I'm also a director in a business in the Isle of Skye. My involvement with land reform, I was previously the chair of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland, and I was involved for 6 years on the board of the buyout group for Eriskay, South Uist and Benbecula, and prior to that, right at the beginning, I was 6 years on the board of the Isle of Gia Heritage Trust. I'm very pleased to be here this evening. Look forward to the debate and discussion and answering your questions. Thanks.
Lorne, thank you. And the other commissioner with us is Megan McInnes. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's great to be here. So I'm one of the other land commissioners. I grew up on the Isle of Skye, and I currently live in Applecross up in the Northwest Highlands. In between, I've worked on land reform internationally at the UN level, as well as in particular countries around the world. So it's great to be able to have this discussion focused in on the Highland region this evening. One of my favourite parts of being a land commissioner was being able to travel around the country and do public meetings in village halls. Obviously, we haven't been able to do that for the last 6 months, so it's great to be able to start these again in a webinar and online version. But hopefully, we'll be able to meet you all in person soon. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Megan. We'll hear more from Megan very shortly. And lastly, Emma. Emma's a senior member of staff, actually fairly recently joined us, but my goodness, has hit the ground running, Emma. So over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, I'm Emma Cooper, and I'm the head of land rights and responsibilities for the Scottish Land Commission. So my job is about seeing the Scottish Government's land rights and responsibilities statement put into practice. So that means things like more community ownership of land, more community engagement in decisions around land, and good stewardship of land. Thanks, Andrew.
Brilliant, Emma, thank you. So let me just say a bit about why we're here. So since we started, the Land Commission kicked off in 2017 after the 2016 Act. And it was one of our most important, I think, early policies was to say, right, we are going to get out and round the country. And once every month, we would hold a public meeting in a village hall somewhere. And we stuck with that. And we've been all around the country ever since, until COVID came along. And I do think that was really important. We can't do that for the moment. We will do it again just as soon as we possibly can. And I do hope that that will be in late spring, summer. Because while I think this format is great, it doesn't beat a village hall talking and the chance to talk privately after a public meeting as well with individuals who may have issues that they want to share privately. So this is not a substitute, but it's an alternative in the meantime. We will tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and we're going to do that shortly. But mostly this, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you in terms of what do you think the issues are? What do you think about what we're doing? What do you think we should be doing? It is ultimately an opportunity for you to hold us to account. And I believe profoundly that public servants should be, and particularly board members of public bodies, should be out there in village halls being held to account. So that's why we're here. And I would urge you to do it. The format, Megan is going to give a wee presentation where she's going to gallop through a huge program of work very, very fast, and she will try not to confuse us in the process. But I don't underestimate the number of different things we're doing in urban and rural Scotland, in the Highlands and central Scotland, and indeed the borders. But she will do that, and then after that, it's over to you. Now, there's something called a chat button on your screen, and if you click on that button, it will give you an opportunity to ask questions or offer comments. And what I will try and do is work our way through your questions and your comments and invite either of the other commissioners or myself or Emma to try and respond and answer if we can. But whether we can or not, we will listen, and this is being recorded so we can think about issues afterwards as well. So that's the format. We said that we would run this from 7 till 8:30, so we will. I think that's only good manners. If you say you're going to do something till 8:30, we will. Of course, if we dry up and everyone's bored and wants to go before 8:30, well, that's fine. We will do. We will wrap it up before 8:30. But in any event, we will wrap up at 8:30. I think I'm known for trying to keep things to time, and I'll stick to my reputation on that one. Let's hand over to Megan. Megan's going to take us through quite a quick gallop. She's also going to share her screen so we can see some slides. So over to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Right, let me just get this set up and see if I can share the screen properly. Are you all able to see that in the full screen version? Great. Okay, so I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just giving a brief introduction to who the Scottish Land Commission is, what it is we've done since we were established in 2017, and what our priorities are going to be for the next 3 years. So we have been tasked with driving forward land reform across Scotland. But what is land reform, and is it still relevant? So I like to start discussing this topic by using some specific examples. So these two photos are, and I could have chosen any number from across Scotland, are a good illustration of why land reform is still a very much a pressing priority in rural and urban Scotland. The top photo is known as the old Tesco site, which is right in the middle of Forres. You can see the high street actually at the back of the photo. About 6 years ago, Tesco moved their supermarket to the outskirts of Forres. This site in the centre of town could have been developed into affordable housing, a hotel, could have been transformed into community space, allotments and play park, instead of which it's just sat empty, and it's now somewhere that people just dump their rubbish in, and there's quite a lot of antisocial behaviour taking place. This site is by no means unique. There's more than 11,000 hectares of land which is vacant and derelict across Scotland. That figure's remained pretty much the same since the 1990s. It's a really persistent problem, and it's one which disproportionately affects our most deprived communities. I want you to imagine that the house in the bottom photo is on a small island, which is entirely owned by a family who live very far away from the island. They visit maybe a couple of times a year, but are most interested in the island in terms of what it provides in terms of shooting and hunting rights. There's a small community of residents on the island, and the people who live there are very concerned about the fact that their population is dwindling and their community is looking increasingly fragile. There's not enough land available for local families to have affordable housing. Business development is also being hindered by the lack of availability of land, and the hotel can't find accommodation for its staff. And the tenant farmers are finding that their houses and farming infrastructure are being run into the ground. The community has come together to try and speak to the landowners about these issues, but the family so far doesn't seem interested at all in discussing with the community the sustainability or long-term resilience of the island. Now, these two examples, and I could have chosen any from across Scotland, illustrate for me and for the Land Commission why land reform is still such an urgent issue and why it's such a key part of the package that's required to make sure that we are able to provide communities and families across Scotland places that they can live and work in successfully, and part of the package which is essential for ensuring that Scotland achieves its ambitions around a well-being economy and in terms of tackling the climate crisis. It's also indicative of the fact that land reform is important for rural as well as urban areas, and it's not a one-off event. It's an ongoing process of evolution and response to external and new and unexpected contexts, such as the COVID pandemic. So who are we? The Scottish Land Commission was established in 2017 by the Scottish Parliament, and our role is to advise on land reform across Scotland. We are 5 land commissioners and 1 tenant farming commissioner, and we're supported by 17 amazing staff who normally are based out of our office in Inverness. Before I get into some of the details about our activities, I just want to give an overview as to 2 key changes which have happened recently in terms of how we think about land reform in Scotland. that came about as part of the 2016 Land Reform Act. So prior to that act, if we had a conversation in Scotland about human rights and land reform, it would have involved in the discussion of how the protection of private property rights was a hindrance and a limit to the progression of land reform. But the 2016 Act brings Scotland in line with the rest of the world in terms of recognising that human rights can actually be a springboard to moving land reform forward, and likewise, land reform can help the Scottish Government and other stakeholders fulfil their obligations towards the broader human rights, particularly what we call economic, social and cultural rights, which are the rights most closely related to land. This change in balance between private property rights and the economic, social and cultural rights is most clearly articulated in a new government policy, also coming out of the 2016 Act, called the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. So this statement is the first of its kind in the world, and in terms of recognising this relationship between land reform and human rights, and it recognises that along with rights to land come responsibilities to your neighbours and local community, as well as responsibilities to the wider public. So these two things, this change in balance of how we think about property rights and human rights, and the fact that along with land rights come responsibilities, are two changes in how we think about land reform, which underpin everything that the Land Commission is trying to do. So what have we been doing since we were established in 2017? Well, in this slide, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the key elements of our work. All of the information about this is available on our website, and we'd be happy to answer more details about this once we get to that part of the webinar this evening. So if we go back to that island example I used this morning, at the beginning of the slide, it's well known that Scotland has a highly unique pattern of private land ownership, and that there are many negative impacts that result from that concentrated pattern of land ownership, especially when it becomes a monopoly in terms of the way that the land is owned and managed and governed. So the Scottish Government asked us to look into the impacts of this pattern of private land ownership, and we published the results of that in April 2019, along with some recommendations for what might be changed to address this, both in terms of legislative measures as well as behaviour and cultural change on the ground. We've been developing some more details of how those legislative options might work. We'll be publishing that in the new year, and they are looking particularly at a test for measuring the public benefit of large-scale land transfers, as well as a statutory land rights and responsibilities review. Going to the other example I started with, the vacant and derelict site in Forres, the fact that Scotland's land market and the way that we are currently valuing land is clearly dysfunctional by the fact that we have sites across Scotland which are vacant and derelict, but on the other hand, there are areas in Scotland where we desperately need land for affordable houses and for other development projects. It's something that the Commission has been spending a lot of time working on since we started. Together with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, we launched the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which has brought national attention to this issue, as can be evident from the fact that it's included in the programme for government and also given high prominence in the current discussions around the new National Planning Framework number 4. We've also been looking at the way in which land is available for housing, both in rural and urban areas. We've been publishing a series of papers on this over the summer, and in February, I think, certainly in the new year, we'll be publishing the culmination of that work and a series of recommendations about what needs to change in the way that land is allocated for housing in order for us to be able to provide homes across Scotland in places that people want to live and at prices they can actually afford. Our Good Practice programme is the work we're doing with landowners, communities and other stakeholders to implement the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. This includes the publication of protocols and guidance, giving further details of how that statement can be implemented in practice, as well as providing training and working with landowners and communities on specific cases. Another very recent piece of work we've done is the publication of advice to the Scottish Government on how to implement regional land use partnerships. So these partnerships are something which has come out of the Land Use Strategy and the Climate Change Act, and they're partnerships which are intended to focus on what needs to change around land use to meet both our land reform ambitions as well as our climate change targets. So the advice we publish looks at the administrative levels at which these partnerships might be implemented, what kind of resources they would need to be effective, and how these partnerships would interact with other existing regional and city deals, spatial planning processes, etc. And then last, but certainly not least, is the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, Dr. Bob McIntosh, whose role is to improve relations between tenant farmers and landowners. I'll speak more about this particular element of our work later on in the presentation. So moving into where we are going over the next 3 years, we've just launched our new strategic plan, which runs from 2020 to 2023, and it has 3 priority areas. The first is reforming land rights, which looks at who owns and uses land. The second is responsible land ownership and use, looking at how that land is owned and used. And the third is around reforming the land markets. And again, this looks at how we value land, how we develop it, and what we need to do to ensure that we're using it more productively. I'm just going to say a few words about each of these. So the first work stream, reforming land rights, looks to reform the way that land rights and ownership are controlled to drive economic, social and environmental values, to strengthen community resilience and to reduce inequalities. This is a work stream that looks both at rural as well as urban areas and is focused in particular at looking at what can be done to address the current inequalities in terms of access to and use and ownership of land. For example, in rural areas, we're looking particularly at what can be done to address the quite catastrophic projections around population decline that the James Hutton Institute has come up with in terms of the within certain areas of the Highland region, and what role changing access and ownership of land can do to help address that population decline. So we're looking at where we will be encouraging and demonstrating the benefits of having a more diverse pattern of land ownership, which will be the natural extension of the work we're doing, where I've already mentioned, which is addressing the problems associated with highly concentrated and monopoly land ownership. We're also going to be identifying new governance models to widen the range of people who benefit from land. This includes work, for example, to support increases in community ownership of land and assets, as well as working with local authorities on how we can derive greater public benefit from our common good land and common good assets. This work will also continue to look at how we are fairly balancing property rights in comparison to economic, social and cultural human rights. The second work stream focuses on accountability and responsibility and embedding responsible land ownership and use in whichever type of ownership and type of landowner we're actually working with across Scotland. So this work stream focuses primarily on working with landowners and communities to implement the land rights and responsibilities statement. So our good practice programme will continue this work. It's supported by an advisory group to help guide this work, which is made up of a number of different membership bodies, including Community Land Scotland, NFUS, DTAS and Scottish Land and Estates. We're going to continue to develop and publish more protocols and guidance, as well as work with communities and landowners on the ground in specific cases. A new area of this work we'll be doing is helping local authorities mainstream this statement within their own public policy operations, as well as working with the private sector in terms of embedding the land rights and responsibility statement within their responsible business conduct practices. And of course, the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner is also looking at embedding responsible land ownership and use within the relationships and the agreements between tenant farmers and landowners. The final work stream is reforming land markets, and this aims to improve the efficiency and equity of land markets to support a fair and productive economy. So this is an extension of the work I already mentioned, which is trying to tackle both the dysfunctionalities in the way that land markets operate across Scotland, as well as the barriers which are created by how we value land. So there have been, we've seen across the UK very significant increases in land values since the mid-90s. In fact, since 1995, we've seen a 450% increase in the value of land, which means that land across the UK is currently valued at around £5 trillion. And this vastly outstrips the values of the buildings and assets, our homes, which are on top of the land. And this has led many to question not only how really how we are fairly distributing that increase in value and what we can do to make sure that that increase in land value benefits the wider society. So for the last couple of years, for example, we've been working with local authorities to help them be able to have tools to gain some of the increase in values of land which results from public policy. What I mean by this is, for example, working with a local authority who has provided planning permission on a particular site or provided the finance for infrastructure on around a particular site, which has led to that site increasing in value. And so we've been looking at tools such as land value capture and land value sharing as a way to help local authorities gain some of that access to that increase in land value. We're also going to be looking at what might change in terms of steps to meet our climate change targets in terms of land values. For example, an increasing focus in reforestation and forestry and forest targets, as well as focusing on peatland restoration and green infrastructure. All of those are likely to change local land values in particular areas. So we want to make sure that those changes in land values are being distributed fairly across society. So separate to the work on land values, we're also doing some work. We will continue doing some work on what kind of changes are required to the tax and fiscal systems to support our land reform aims. We published a couple of years ago some work looking at options for introducing a land value tax in Scotland. And just last week, we published a new report which takes a much wider scoping view at what kind of changes to our tax system can help support our land reform objectives. We've just established an expert group to help guide this, which is being led by my fellow Commissioner, Lorne McLeod, who I know is going to be able to answer any of your questions about this work once I finish my presentation. We are also looking at some more practical options on the ground for reforming land markets. For example, working with local authorities to make sure that commercial developments are providing better local benefits to local communities, as well as continuing this work looking at the role of land, the extent to which land is available for housing, and when there are barriers and challenges there, what can be done to address them. So in the final part of this presentation, I just wanted to say a few words about the Tenant Farming Commissioner. So this is Dr. Bob McIntosh, and his role is to improve relations between tenant farmers and landowners. Bob and the team have, since 2017, and this work will continue into our new strategic plan, they have been publishing a series of codes of practice and guidance notes, and they've been responding to alleged breaches in those codes and helping rebuild relationships between landowners and tenant farmers in particular areas. We've been doing a lot of work also supporting new entrants, so young folk who are keen to get involved in the farming sector but are struggling to access farming tenancies or find other ways of getting involved. For example, a couple of years ago, together with the Scottish Government and NFUS, we launched the Land Matching Service. We've also been developing some business incubator models which could help young farming entrepreneurs to find the space, the land and the resources to develop and test some of their new ideas in a way which is minimising the risk for them. The Scottish Government undertook a review of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, the results of which was published earlier on this year. And this was very supportive of the work that Bob has done so far and recommended considering expanding both the remit and the powers of the Tenant Farming Commissioner. And it's because of the success of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, particularly around the codes of practice and the ability for those affected to allege a breach of those codes, that we've been looking at how we can adapt that model and expand it and develop it further within our good practice programme, particularly in terms of the roles that the land rights responsibilities protocols play in terms of realising those new expectations on landowners and communities on the ground. So I'm going to finish now and hand back to Andrew, but I'm happy to elaborate on any of the things I touched on, because this was a quick race through a lot of detail. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Megan, thank you. It was a race and there's a lot of detail, but it was very clear. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll try and elaborate on the detail in response to your questions or your observations. I do emphasize we're not just here to answer questions. We would like to hear your own thoughts as well. I've got a question already emailed in from Councillor Alan Henderson over in Mallaig. So I'm just going to kick that off in order to get the conversation flowing. But can I just remind you again, essentially we're now up to 59 people, which is great. If you click on that button that says chat, you can then ask, you just type your question in there and I'll try and make sure that we get to it, or type your comment or anything else, as long as it's polite, please just go for it. Now, the question emailed to us by Councillor Henderson, I think, is a really helpful one to kick us off. So his question is, I'll just read it. Do you feel that the Commission have enough power to make a real difference to community land ownership? So two big issues there. One, the issue of power and powers, and the other, the issue of land ownership. And we'd be careful here because we're not a local authority, we're not democratically elected, and so we are essentially an advisor to government and to elected authorities. We have recommended new powers for government, and both local and central. On the whole, we don't have a lot of statutory power, but we have a lot of power in other ways. I think to try and deal with that, I'm going to ask Lorne first to talk a bit about, particularly from the point of view of community land ownership, about which Lorne knows a great deal. And then I'm going to come to Emma to maybe broaden it, Emma, because power is just a word. What does it mean, and how do we influence, and so on and so forth. So we'll look at that as well. But Lorne, would you like to kick us off with your thoughts on this?
Okay, thanks for that question. And I saw Alan Henderson in the screen earlier, so it's good to see Alan here tonight. I think we've got a lot of legislation already that could help community land ownership. We've obviously got the Land Reform Act of 2003 that brought in the community right to buy, and we've also got the Crofting right to buy as well. The Community Empowerment Act that was 2015 gives a community right to buy for abandoned and neglected land. The Land Reform Act of 2016 also brings in a community right to buy to advance sustainable development. So there's a lot within that, and the rollout, particularly of the right to buy for sustainable development, really hasn't had much impact, just because the actual rules and regulations around that have just been rolled out recently. So I think that'll be useful to just kind of watch that space there. I think at the end of the day, a lot of the community buyouts are by negotiation. I think that's something we would like to see a lot more of, that there are very few that resort to legislation. Having said that, legislation always has its place in terms of underpinning work and activities. And I think Megan, just there in our presentation, touched on the role of our Tenant Farming Commissioner. And it will be interesting when we see the manifestos for the Scottish Parliament appear from the various political parties, if parties are looking at any new Land Reform Act within the time of the new Parliament, because there is a body of thought out there that some of the work that we are doing on protocols should have a similar status to that is held by the Tenant Farming Commissioner, with his codes and the fact that he can make recommendations on breaches, can take action. And perhaps that's some of the activity or some of the actual things that might be included in a potentially new Land Reform Act. But I think, going back to the original question, I think we've got a lot of legislation there. I think we should just see a wee bit longer, just, the implementation of some of the practicalities of that. But at the end of the day, I think negotiated transfers for community land ownership are always preferred. But thanks very much for the question. Obviously, you'll have a lot of experience yourself, being heavily involved in the rum, egg, Neudert buyouts, and know the practical situation on the ground. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Lorne. Emma, let's just broaden this a bit and talk about the protocols, and particularly the protocols that we've issued around this, and maybe pick up that theme from Lorne, that there's a bit of a disconnect at the moment in that we've got codes of practice for the tenant farming, but not yet for these other things. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and great question. Thanks, Alan. So yeah, we have these protocols, and we have 8 of them now, and they cover a wide range of topics, all related to the Scottish Government's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And some of them are specifically related to this question. And the protocols really are expectations for landowners. Some of them are things that we strongly suggest landowners do, and some of them are things that we recommend landowners consider doing. And there's also some reference in there to how communities should be acting as well. So that's really intended to make it very clear for everybody what's expected and what we think is fair and reasonable. And we developed them with some really key stakeholders. So Community Land Scotland is one of them, Scottish Land and Estates is another, Development Trust Association Scotland, Scottish Property Federation, so covering a wide range of different types of landowners and community organisations as well. And they've been really helpful for us because we published the majority of them earlier this year, and we've had lots of inquiries since, people coming to us and saying that they think that maybe a community organisation or maybe a landowner isn't behaving in quite the way that they would hope that they would behave. And in that case, we can refer both parties back to the protocols, we can set out what expectations we have, and we can work with both parties to find a way, a mutually agreeable solution, or find a way through things, really. So that's been really helpful for us having those. But as has been said, they are voluntary. So we have, we can suggest that people follow them. We can get in contact with people. We can help them understand. We can help them work out how to put them into practice. And those membership organisations I mentioned have been really supportive of that too. But we can't make people do those things. Whereas the Tenant Farming Commission, they have a statutory underpinning for their equivalent, which are called codes of practice. And it would be helpful, let's say, if that was there for the protocols as well. So we'd be in favour of that. But we're doing an awful lot of positive stuff on a voluntary basis with landowners all across Scotland. So we've made good progress there. Thanks, Andrew.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. I'm looking now for some. I've got a question come up, so we're just going to go to that. I just mentioned, and we've got behind the scenes two absolutely brilliant members of staff, Jess and Sarah. I wonder if one of you could possibly put up, please, a link to the protocol, well, particularly the one about community engagement, but the link to the protocol. And could you also please put up a link to the report we did on community ownership, because a lot of some sort of quite useful background that people might like to look at there. So that'll maybe help people. But if you can't find your way to these things at the moment, don't worry. If you go to our website, you can find all this stuff tomorrow when you've had your morning coffee. You'll probably be in better form if you're anything like me. Right, let's deal with this question from Anna McConnell. Hi, Anna. Good to see you, actually, and thank you for coming. I've known Anna for a long, long time. So I'm just going to read it, but I imagine you can probably all see it. There's a continuing situation in Sutherland where, and this is Anders Poulsen we're talking about, is amassing a very large amount of land and property, houses, shops, and a number of things. And obviously, he's able to do that because he can pay a high price. And the question is, what can be done to stop this damaging local communities if local people are getting locked out of the ability to buy a house or buy a piece of land to do something because they can't compete on price? So, Lauren, let's start with you. So there's issues about what can we do. The question is, what can be done? I think we might also want to talk about what we think should be done in the future, because there's at the end of the day, our role is as much to advise governments on future policy and legislation as it is to sort things right now. Lauren, why don't you start?
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Anna. Obviously, this is an issue. When before lockdown, we had a public meeting in Tongue, and prior to that, we had one in Durness, where this issue had risen regarding the purchase of land and property in North Sutherland and the North Coast there. One of the things I would want to just put out there is the fact that we have done an awful lot of work on concentrated land ownership, monopoly land ownership, and indeed we are going to publish our sort of final proposals relating to that early in the new year. One of the things that we're looking at is a public interest test for land ownership of scale. Now that obviously affects a situation where at the point of purchase, Anna outlines a situation which occurs at the moment there. And indeed, our studies on looking at concentrated land ownership, monopoly land ownership, found very much that very similar to a monopoly situation in a business sense, where the Competition and Markets Authority intervene, there is the need for intervention by a body such as the Scottish Land Commission, or whether it be a local authority or Scottish Government in these situations. So, as I say, we're going to have detailed proposals coming out there. I would say that the other aspect of work that we're involved with at the moment that maybe would pertain to a situation such as that is indeed the work that we're undertaking on reviewing tax in relationship to land and property. And, you know, that there's been a wide range of opinions out there about land value taxes, about changes to tax, whether that's supplements and land and building transaction tax on the purchase of large estates, whether it's powers to local authorities to levy additional tax in some form of a local tax that could generate additional revenues for local authorities and could be levied on some large landowners where it has been considered that there is a monopoly situation that exists. So I think there's a wide range of work that we're looking at the moment. I know that there is a very difficult situation there in North Sutherland at the moment that has been fed back to us by various individuals. And I think it's something that we are looking at as the Land Commission. But I'll maybe just stop there and allow others to maybe comment on that.
Lauren, thanks. So, I mean, there are other questions coming in, so I don't want us to dwell too long on this. But what's very clear is that at the moment, powers are limited. And when you say what can be done now, the answer is a lot of it does depend on voluntary cooperation. So I'm going to ask Emma just to say a wee bit about how do we go about that. We've had dialogue with a number of big landowners now to try and improve, well, to be blunt, to change behaviour, improve engagement with communities and so on and so forth. So I'm going to ask Emma to say a bit about that, but I do underline what Lauren said. You know, we're very clear that as things stand, the public interest is not that well protected, and we will be recommending, we've already recommended in outline key measures, and a link's just been put up on that. We will publish in January a great deal more detailed thinking on that. But Emma, meantime, how are we getting on, and a wee bit on that, please?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I can sense the frustration there because it's a real challenge for communities. You can ask landowners yourself or work with a local community group, preferably a community council or development trust or so on, and write to the landowner and outline some of your concerns. We would encourage you to be open with landowners about concerns whenever you have them, polite but open, and refer to our protocols. The link's been popped in the chat, and explain why this is of concern for your community. And hopefully the landowner will come back to you and enter into a dialogue about that. And hopefully you can reach some better understanding on both sides around what it is that the community is hoping to achieve and what it is that the landowner is hoping to achieve, and see where progress can be made there. If you're not getting a response from a landowner, then do get in touch, and we will see if we can make any progress for you. And I'm afraid that's all that I can offer at the moment that I can think of, Andrew. But get in touch if you want to talk about it more.
Thanks, Emma. So I do emphasise what Emma's just said, get in touch. We have, on a number of occasions already, communities have contacted us and said, look, this landowner is simply not behaving in an acceptable way. And we've gone and we've spoken to them. And we have had influence, and we have delivered change without statutory power. So that's encouraging. We don't think that's enough, and we will be recommending more in January. But we're not, you know, we're not. I was going to say toothless. I mean, in a sense, we are toothless, but we still have clout, and we'll use it. So please contact us if you're not happy. And we'll try and deal with it. Now, I need to move on to make sure I keep up with the questions coming in. So the next question, I think I'm going to take to you, Megan, if that's okay. So the next question is essentially about housing. So there's some points of detail about council tax, which are probably best for local authorities. But just, you want to say some wider points about this whole business of big landowners and housing and access to land for housing and indeed empty housing, and just where we're going on that. And you might mention the work that we've done already. Can I pass that to you, Megan?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I mean, in terms of the specifics points raised in the question, I think I would refer back to what Lauren already said in terms of the way that the options for reforming various parts of tax systems is something that we are looking at in terms of how they might apply in this particular situation or not. So kind of watch that space on sort of council tax specifically. I mean, in general, though, no, I mean, we are absolutely aware of the fact that the lack of availability of affordable housing in rural areas was a hugely problematic issue prior to COVID. Since the pandemic, we've seen the rate of demand for housing across the Highlands and Islands, and the fact that this is pushing affordability far beyond the reach of local communities escalate even dramatically more. And this is a problem in my community in Applecross, and we hear regularly about this being a problem right throughout the Highlands and Islands. So the fact that we've been doing work on this is in my view very timely in terms of helping to contribute to where there are some solutions. So we worked with Savills to undertake a study of the extent to which why land is not being made available for affordable housing in a number of different rural areas, and to identify what the kind of challenges were there. That report is on the website. Maybe Sarah or Jess, you could put a link to that if it's easily available. Otherwise, it's quite easy to find. The conclusions of that study was that it's not quite as simple as large estates withholding land from being made available to housing. There are a series of much wider challenges there. Some of the challenges are in relation to the way that the planning system works, and it's good to see in the recent the current, I'm trying to remember the name of this, the government's response to the consultation on the National Planning Framework 4. They issued a statement recently, and in that statement they talk about the need to ensure that the planning system is working in terms of achieving repopulation objectives in rural areas. So it's clear that that's going to be priority for any additional amendments to planning policy. But it's also clear that there are issues around the way in which the fact that the provision of affordable housing in remote rural parts of Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, depends not on large-scale developers who provide housing in the Central Belt, but on development trusts and groups like the Highland Small Communities Housing Trust. They've just changed their name, haven't I? Sorry, I can't remember what their new name is. But so there's a really important role for those, and those kind of groups need more support. So it's also great that the government's just announced the extension of the housing fund for rural areas and also for the islands. I think there's also, so I think that this is something that we're going to continue to work on. As I said already, the culmination of all of our big study on the way in which land is available for housing in rural and urban areas is going to be published in February, I think. That's going to include a range of different recommendations, some of which are going to be focused on changing the laws. As Lauren said, we hope this is going to be able to feed into discussions about manifestos and what will come up in the new Parliament. But there are other changes that can be easily made in terms of behaviour and policy on the ground right now that don't require statutory changes. So I hope that we're going to see some movement here, and some of the barriers that communities like mine are currently facing being removed as we move into over the next year or so, because it has been particularly difficult seeing the response to the pandemic and what that's meant, because it has really exacerbated the problems on the ground.
Thanks, Megan. So again, a challenge where at the moment the powers are limited. We have made some recommendations, the link's just gone up there, but there are more recommendations to come. The guts of what I think we're going to be saying is, let's take a look across the North Sea and let's see how others do it. And what you see is that local government is much more assertive, muscular perhaps, in driving the supply of housing land. In Scotland, we tend to rely on land being brought forward by landowners. So that's the guts of it, but there'll be more to come. Now, just before we leave this, Emma, I wonder if you could just briefly comment. At the end of that question was, what's their responsibility in maintaining woodlands, etc. Just a very brief comment on the land use partnership work and the whole business of responsible land ownership, please.
Yep, so in Scotland, of course, we have the right to roam, so you can go anywhere on foot on any land outside people's gardens. And that means that landowners do need to ensure that land and paths and footways and so on are maintained and kept safe. So we have a protocol on good stewardship of land, which asks for landowners to look after their land in a responsible way. And part of being responsible is around access and recreation and so on, and maintaining things like woodlands and peatlands and wetlands and so on and so forth.
Emma, thanks. So I think we should move on. So there's now 2 questions about crofting, and I'm going to come to Lorne. So there's essentially 2 different questions there, Lorne. So a little bit about, where does the whole business of crofting tenure sit in our thinking and our relationship with the Commission? And then the second question is more about under the new Crofting Act, it's not that new now, the whole business of the requirement to make proper use of your land, and which isn't, some people don't think it's working terribly well, but let's hear from you, Lorne.
Okay, thanks for that. I think on the first point there, I'm seeing the actual questions at the side of my screen there. I think the first point is, how do we kind of interact with the Crofting Commission? So we've met with the Crofting Commission, I think a few of the commissioners on one occasion, and then with the actual board itself of the Crofting Commission. So we do interact with the Crofting Commission. The question then goes on to kind of talk about the large hectares of land that's under crofting tenure, and how does that sit in with our thinking? Well, different from tenant farming, we don't see crofting land as a separate land tenure that we're looking at in greater detail. There is obviously a Crofting Commission which looks at crofting in Scotland there, but a lot of the work that we undertake, and the broad range of work that we undertake, obviously impinges on crofting. And Emma mentioned recently there about the good stewardship of land in terms of one of our protocols. And again, within that specific protocol, we set out the requirements relating to good stewardship and good use of land. So similar to any other person who has land in various types of tenure, the crofting land is subject to that specific protocol. But obviously, as we mentioned earlier, we don't have the actual power to enforce these things. Again, we try to encourage best practice as we go along. So there is a specific issue there. In my experience also, there are issues in relation to crofting. The state I was sat on the board of the Shallow na Benamore in South Uist Eriskine, but Benbecula had a large number of absentee crofters, and I think that is something that perhaps needs to be tackled a lot more focus put on that to encourage better use of croft land, and indeed encourage those who are an increasing number of young people that are looking for crofts to get their first foot on a ladder and get into crofting, because inevitably thereafter there is the ability to move forward with housing development and business development and adding to community. So there are a whole load of issues in there, but I would say that we don't look at crofting entirely different from the rest of the land ownership in Scotland. And a lot of our actual work that we're undertaking on a policy basis dovetails with the crofting very much. So I'll just kind of leave that there.
Lauren, thank you. I need to keep this going to keep up with the questions, but can I just add a couple of things on that? I was a crofting commissioner for a while, so the question is absolutely right. The Crofting Commission does, in certain circumstances, have powers to require crofters to make proper use, and there is a whole raft of provisions around neglected land and also absentee crofters. The government decided to leave the Crofting Commission alone and not to put us into that position. So we do have our staff have a regular dialogue with them. The boards meet from time to time. It is important we do so. If you do want more information about that, we can point you to to how to find out more. This is for Lindsay McLean, but I think actually there's a pretty good bit on the Crofting Commission website, from what I remember, around dereliction of crofts. I must move this on to keep up now. So the next question is from Elaine Hodgson. Thanks, Elaine. Is there a chance to comment on the report? So yes, is the short answer, but just to elaborate very briefly. When we did the original piece of work on scale and concentration, there was actually quite a major call for evidence, and I can't remember, well over 100 people contributed, some anonymously, and there was some pretty shocking evidence that actually came in. The report in January, yes, we would absolutely welcome comment, very much so. So please, please do. And actually, can I just make a more general point? We welcome, we don't run these public meetings just for entertainment purposes. It's in order to get communication going between us and the people of Scotland, for whom land reform is being planned and delivered. So please contact us anytime through the website or through the email address. There's the report on rural housing I mentioned, and there's more to come on that. Now let's go on to the climate stuff, which is, in fact, there was a report published yesterday, a lot in that report about land use change. And the question is, what role does land ownership play in delivering these commitments? That's the climate things, and how might the Land Commission assist communities in engaging in those? So I think, Emma, that is one for you, if you don't mind, at least to start with, because it's very much at the front of your mind, I know that. So over to you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this, actually. Land ownership plays a huge role because landowners decide how land is used, and land use obviously has a significant impact on climate change and on whether we can achieve those targets or not. So the Land Commission has recently published a report on regional land use partnerships. And regional land use partnerships were first talked about in 2016 in the land use strategy. And they are really a way of ensuring that we bring people together to make land use decisions at a regional level so that we can meet those really ambitious climate change targets. So it's acknowledging that we have national targets and national outcomes that we want to achieve, but we can't achieve those by working at individual landowner level, land holding level. So we have to bring people together in order to make those decisions. So the regional land use partnerships propose that we do that across rural and urban Scotland, and we bring people together to make those decisions. And we have a board of people who lead those partnerships, comprised of people from the local community, people with sectoral expertise, and people who are elected representatives in terms of local councillors or Scottish Government representatives. And those partnerships will help everybody come together to decide on what the priorities are for that region in terms of how land should be managed and used. And they will direct rural funding to ensure that, they will direct funding, a variety of funding streams, to ensure that there is the appropriate support and resourcing in place to achieve those collective objectives. So we're expecting those to be taken forward in the next parliamentary term, so after the election next year. Communities community engagement will be a key part of those regional land use partnerships, so they will be expected to meet the highest standards of community engagement to ensure that people are involved both in the decision making and in the delivery of reaching those climate change targets, so practical projects as well as decision making. Is that okay, Andrew?
Emma, thanks. I'm not doing very well at keeping up on up to speed on the questions, but thank you. That was really helpful. But the short answer to Neil's question is absolutely. Land ownership must play a big role, and land reform and land use are two sides of the same coin. We're very, very clear about that. And responsible land use is where we need to get to through whatever tools. Let's move on, please, because there's one or two more points about homes, and I want to try and pull those together. So the point about holiday cottages, and there's a planning issue in there, and then a follow-on point from Marion. Sorry, Marion, I probably misinterpreted your first question, not about land for housing, but about empty houses. And that is also an issue about responsible land ownership and not allowing houses, for example, on tenanted farms and elsewhere. So Megan, I'm sorry to come back to you, but I think it might be helpful to pick up on those further housing points. Would you mind, please?
No, absolutely. And yeah, sorry, Marion, for not properly reading your earlier question. To deal with that issue at the moment, I think our answer is similar to the answer we had in terms of the Sutherland case. We have limited powers at the moment, which are focused on houses being left to decay and empty, being another example of what we would not consider to be the kind of responsible land ownership that is required through the Land Rights Responsibility Statement. At the moment, we're able to engage with that on a case-by-case basis, but we are hoping that this is going to be something which this is certainly something that we are looking at in terms of the one of the statutory proposals, the statutory options that I talked about during the presentation that have come out of the concentrated land ownership work. One of the statutory proposals that we're going to be publishing in more detail in January, where we would be looking at all of the different elements of all the different principles within the Land Rights Responsibility Statement and using them as a basis for what we're calling a statutory review of those principles. So obviously the kind of responsible, we're looking at responsible land ownership, not just in terms of kind of land use decision making, but also the upkeep and management of empty homes and properties on those sites. In more general, though, I think there is such a wide range of discussions at the moment about the need to focus on addressing affordable housing in general within remote rural areas and around the need for addressing the repopulation question, that it's going to become increasingly unacceptable across different types of policy and legislative frameworks for larger states to let existing housing stock go to ruin. To go to Jamie's question around the fact that the government, it seems to be completely focused on long-term empty homes, but has a blind spot regarding holiday houses. I'm not sure I'd agree with you, Jamie. I mean, the government has just done a consultation on measures that measures that they're proposing that could be introduced to tackle short-term lets, looking at both the wide-scale licensing as well as introducing control areas. This is something that could potentially be quite powerful in terms of helping give local authorities the ability to restrict the extension of more short-term holiday homes in particular areas. So I think that there is potential work being done there. As usual, these things are in the pipeline and they take a while to go through the statutory sort of consultation requirements. What still seems to be a gap, certainly from the perspective of someone living in Applecross, is second homes, which are not short-term lets, which are currently falling out of the current proposals that are being looked at by government. So that's still an issue, and we'll have to see if there's any proposals coming forward to address those kind of empty second homes, which are removing housing stock from local communities, but it's falling out with the target on the measures on addressing short-term lets. I think that's probably enough on that. Thanks.
Megan, thank you. So it is quite a complex area, the whole business of housing, and these questions are really bang on the button. Actually, it's you know, there's short-term lets, but there's also second homes and all the rest of it. And it isn't. You know, to be slightly fair to government, it is a very fraught and difficult area, but there are answers, and it's part of our job to help find those answers. So we need to find these answers, and we need to look at what other countries do too. I'm going to move on. Anna, it's not really a question, but I'd like to pick it up. Anna's point: legislation to stop monopoly land holdings is being created is too slow, and I think a lot of people would agree with you on that. And there is a lot of frustration, and there's no question that we have already legislated in this country to deal with many other monopolies, and we're a bit slow to deal with the land monopoly, and we're quite slow by European standards. Most countries in Europe have some sort of controls over this of one sort or another. And if you read the report we published a while ago, we provide quite a lot of examples of how other countries do it. So it's not rocket science. To be fair to government and to be fair to Parliament, there are an awful lot of pressures on Parliament and on government, and finite time and finite numbers of lawyers to write these things and all the rest of it. So I'm not making excuses, but I think one has to understand the challenges that government face. We have I think a fairly strong expectation there will be another Land Reform Act in the next Parliament. We may be wrong, but that is our expectation. And certainly, as I've said repeatedly, we'll publish in January, and we do expect that to get picked up. Ian Muir, Ian, good of you to put this point. I'm going to take this to you, Lorne, if I may. So the Community Empowerment Act, which Lorne actually mentioned earlier, is very important, and part of that is the asset transfer provisions. Would you like to say? I'm not sure if you can see this question, Lorne, but if you can, could you respond?
Yeah, I've seen that. I hope I've picked it up correctly there. I think the question is relation to asset transfer, but to the private sector. Now, obviously, the legislation is all about asset transfer to communities. Regarding that one there, what I would also come back to and highlight is that we obviously have a protocol relating to diversification of land ownership and encourage best practice and looking at options there. Highland Council, you refer to them there that they should maybe be acting in the spirit of the Community Empowerment Act. That's one I would pass to the Highland Council to answer rather than myself specifically on that. But at the end of the day, I can see how any community would perhaps wish to concentrate on those projects that they want to deliver on behalf of the community. And from time to time, the private sector is the best route for taking forward a project. And indeed, much of our work is when we're looking at diversification of land ownership, it's not all about, and indeed it should not all be all about community land ownership. We would also like to see more people, private individuals owning land, greater diversity of private land ownership, because that is obviously of great benefit to developing new business opportunities, creating new housing, and embedding our communities, population in our communities, particularly in the rural areas. So that's something that we're very much about as well. But taking the letter of the law, as it were, in the Community Empowerment Act, is obviously all really about the transfer of assets to communities. So don't know if I can go too much further on that, Andrew.
Lorne, thanks. And Ian, if you want to come back on the chat, please do. I'll try and pick it up. But I mean, there is no question that I have a reasonable knowledge of the car parking at Stackpolly Point. I was involved in the footpath upgrade there years ago. I mean, there's no question that communities can take over assets like that. And there are examples, there's one in Skye at the moment, of communities taking over land, in that case from the Forestry Commission at Fairy Pools, and developing car parking and charging for it and making it work. So these things can be done, and it may not be perfect, but actually I do think the community asset transfer provisions are producing some real results across the country, not in any sense just in rural Scotland, extraordinary things happening in urban Scotland, in the Central Belt. Jamie McIntyre, should large landowners be subject to the same responsibilities as crofters? And my immediate answer is absolutely yes. But I think I'm going to go further. We have the land rights and responsibilities statement, which spells out loud and clear that with land rights go responsibilities. So I'm going to come back to Megan to say perhaps a little bit more on that, Megan, if I may. But the one thing I would emphasize is that we are saying loud and clear that in the case of large landowners, it's not just about responsibilities such as crofters have. Where there are monopoly risks, the risk that the power that goes with the scale of a land holding puts the public interest at risk, then we may need to go further than just a question of responsibilities. But Megan, just briefly on the land rights and responsibilities bit, please.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the land rights responsibility statement applies to everyone, applies to crofters, it applies to all types of landowners. It is clear, though, that the expectations on crofters and on other types of, for example, community land ownership groups is at the moment to meet public benefit objectives in the case of community landowners, and to meet the kind of requirements that crofters are expected to meet under crofting legislation is a heavier burden than large-scale private landowners currently expected to meet in statute, which is one of the reasons why we've been pushing for this combination of evolving the land rights responsibility statement into a statutory review mechanism, and looking at this public interest test as a means to a public interest test for large-scale land transfers as a means to try and make that the balance more fair between the expectations on crofting community and community landowners and large-scale private landowners, or even small-scale private landowners. So I think that is something that we'll hopefully begin to see movement on in the coming months. I also just quickly, Andrew, wanted to go back to Ian's question in terms of the community asset transfer, because this is a good example of one of the key findings from the review on community right to buy mechanisms, which we undertook and published back in 2018, where we're seeing that the various different community rights to buy are still not yet meeting actually the diverse range of needs that community groups have across Scotland. So we made recommendations as a result of that report, which included looking at the overall legislative framework and making sure that actually it's a bit more flexible and streamlined on the one hand, because it's extremely complicated, and more flexible to meet the needs of communities, removing some of these things which are creating barriers to communities moving forward with land ownership projects. And those recommendations have fed into a leadership group that the Scottish Government is hosting, which is looking at these issues and looking at the various different legislative changes which we might see in the next Parliament around the community right to buy. So we're hoping that some of these more problematic areas might be resolved in some changes to the legislation coming shortly.
Megan, thanks very much. Jamie, this is a really important question. I'm going to ask Emma to say a bit about it as well, because there is no question. I mean, the 2016 Act is loud and clear: with rights go responsibilities. You know, if you want to own land, then you take on a responsibility. It's a bit like the biblical principle that with privilege goes obligation, and it's inescapable. The two are interlinked and inseparable. Now, Emma's done a huge amount of work on these protocols, which essentially are setting out, look, mate, if you want to own land, then this is what good looks like. This is what your responsibilities look like. Do you want to say a bit more about your experience, Emma? And I mean, just say a wee bit about the extent to which we're getting traction and response, and recognizing that, you know, we've got a bit to go in terms of maybe making some of this a bit more, putting it on a bit more of a statutory footing. But at the moment, how are you getting on?
Yeah, we're making good progress in many respects. So we have worked with a number of landowners recently to carry out a self-assessment of what they're doing. So this is an assessment against the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. So this is for landowners to say, how well am I meeting the expectations in there? And that's been really interesting to get landowners to kind of take that step back, review their practice, and provide us with evidence that, you know, the part of the self-assessment is, what evidence do you have that you're doing these things and considering these issues? And that's been, for some landowners, pretty straightforward. And I think our record is getting a response in about 2 hours. Somebody managed it in 2 hours. But for the most part, it's challenging for landowners, and they haven't necessarily considered these issues before. And when we think about landowners, I just wanted to, I suppose, remind everybody, sometimes we forget that landowners are hugely different to each other, I suppose. And one of the challenges we've had with the self-assessments has been, how does this apply to a private rural estate landowner versus how it applies to a public body versus how it applies to an urban developer? And actually, it is taking a little time to work through those differences between those different sectors and think about, yeah, in practical terms, what does that actually mean for how you're acting in all of those different contexts, and trying to balance the different kinds of decisions that landowners make. So that's been great to tease that out, and that really lays the foundation for us thinking about those kind of statutory measures further down the line, so that we're prepared to, and we can be really clear about what that actually needs to look like when we look at taking that step.
Thanks, Emma, and Jamie. Thanks for raising this. We're going to come back to this again and again over the next few years. There is no question. The message needs to go out loud and clear. If you want to own land in Scotland, you own a responsibility, and you need to fulfil it. And we will continue to be loud and clear about that. And certainly, my impression, and I think Emma's impression, is that a lot of landowners want to do it right. They actually don't want to be slagged off in the media and all the rest of it. They want to get it right. They don't quite know how to get it right. They don't know what good looks like, and Emma's busy spelling it out for them. Thank you, Emma. There will be cases, however, where people think that they can parachute in with a big checkbook and do what they like, and we will need to deal with that going forwards. Now, Mike Danson, thank you. The Just Transition. I wondered when we'd get the Just Transition Commission. Great stuff. Possibly not everyone will have heard of this, and it may sound horribly bureaucratic, but it is actually quite important. And the whole business of land use, land reform is right in there. Your question is mainly about moving to the net zero, but the Just Transition Commission, I think, is about a bit more than that. We can probably get comment from Emma or Megan on this, I would think. Does either of you want to volunteer? No, dear. Thank you, Megan. I knew one of you would. Over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Andrew, and yeah, thanks, Mike, for raising this. I was going to come back to this point later on if we had the chance. So Mike, you can probably explain this better than I can, but the purpose of one of the roles of the Just Transition Commission is to look at the way in which we are setting policies and legislation and practice towards meeting our climate change targets, and to making sure that we're doing that in a way which is just, so that the transition to a net zero economy and a net zero society isn't exacerbating inequalities or isn't making things actually more difficult for communities, so that to ensure that what we have at the end is a transition to the climate emergency, which is actually improving and making lives for everyone more fair, as well as addressing the kind of fundamental elements of the climate emergency. So in terms of what it means for land reform and land use, this goes back in a way to what I said during the presentation about the fact that the way in which we respond in terms of changing land use to our climate targets could have a significant impact on land values in a way which risks the benefits of the efforts, and particularly subsidies, etc., being available to meet those targets, being not equitably shared across Scotland. We might also, I've also heard concerns amongst a number of groups that efforts, for example, to meet forestry targets will automatically lead to a kind of large scale, industrial scale focus on forestry production and reforestation, rather than thinking about community woodlands and much smaller scale woodland crofts and a whole range of other ways in which we can still meet those forestry targets, but in a way which doesn't, to meet those targets in a way which helps support the wider objectives around improving diversity of land ownership and access and use of land. So it's a really important element, and I've used forestry as an example, but you could also talk about this in terms of the making sure that the benefits are equitably shared in terms of green infrastructure, or a whole range of other efforts that we need to take as a country to meet these climate change targets. And it's about thinking about making sure that we're meeting climate change targets and simultaneously meeting our human rights obligations, rather than just meeting the climate change targets in a very quantitative and numerical sense, without thinking about the just and fair outcomes as well.
Megan, thanks, and Mike, thanks for that question. It is really important that the link to the just transition is pretty fundamental, I think. I'm going to move on because I'm both running out of time and I haven't got all the way down the list. Jamie's follow-on point, I just want to pick that one up with Lorne, not so much about, so Jamie's making the point that this is not so much, it's not just about short-term, that's also about second homes, and we did pick that up in part, and there's no question that we recognize that, and that there are policy thinking around could you put occupancy criteria on houses. There's also policy thinking about using tax to make second homes much more difficult, or at least expensive. I'm not sure we can go much further, Jamie, on that here, but what I would like to do is ask Lauren to say a bit more about our work on tax. Just in a sense, taking this hook here. Would you mind doing that? Just to quick sort of outline where Lauren's leading on tax for us, and he's got a pretty ambitious plan. Over to you, Lauren.
Okay, well, we're happy to see something on tax, but I would also want to stress to Jamie that, I think he makes his points very well about second homes, and maybe there's a lot more that we need to be doing on that. So I think we'll take that away. But in terms of tax, the Land Commission has been busy on a lot of reports and research and evidence gathering in relation to tax on land and property. It's obviously very important. Now, tax isn't always the most exciting topic. You go into a room and say hands up for more tax, there won't be many hands going up. So we're starting from a situation there that we want to engender greater discussion on the future of taxation in relation to land and property. What we have done is that we undertook commissioning of a scoping report that looks at all the options. And it's not just about tax, it's also about various fiscal levers like council tax, non-domestic rates. But we're looking at the whole gambit of the various taxes, those that are reserved to Westminster and those that come under the Scottish Government competency there. So we're looking at land and building transaction tax, we're looking at inheritance tax, whether that be agricultural property relief, business property relief, capital gains tax, all these things. How much influence, particularly on reserved issues, that we can make will be a question that we'll see in due course. But we have set up a tax advisory group that has experts from Turk and Connell, somebody who deals with private landowners, through to people that are from the community landowning sector, also the Director of Taxation at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. So we've got some real specialist knowledge there. And that group met for the first time last week and considered the scoping report, particularly looking at those measures that could be introduced under the Scottish Government competency in terms of changes, and particularly looking at things like vacant and derelict land and how to get more land, brownfield sites back into use, but also post-COVID to make sure that there don't become more derelict sites in Scotland. But we're also looking at land ownership of scale and concentrated land ownership, and also perhaps recommendations on tax changes that can change behaviours in that regard. So there's a pile of work ahead of us. The future meetings, we're going to be looking more about some of the long-term principles and some of the reserved issues to Westminster there. But we would welcome any feedback from individuals just to the Land Commission itself. But I think we're due to report at the end of the summer this year. So it's really just a very exciting work, actually. And we hope to, as I say, publish a report end of the summer. Thanks, Andrew.
Lauren, thank you. Now we're heading towards past, and there's still some great questions coming in. So I'm going to have to, well, I'll see how we go. I might even have to just extend a wee bit, but having promised to close at 8:30, I might not. Anyway, next question is the concept of rewilding. I'm going to turn to Megan on this. It absolutely goes to the guts of rights and responsibilities. We are very clear. You can't just buy a chunk of land and do what you like. And rewilding is, in a sense, no different from turning it into a grouse moor in that regard. Megan, quick comment on this. Maybe keep it quite tight because of time, please.
Yes, sure, Andrew. I mean, this is something that we have discussed quite a bit within the Commission. I mean, I think our view on this is that rewilding is not particularly a helpful term because it's not got a very specific definition. It's applied in very different ways in different places. If you think about the difference between what the Allerdale estate are doing and what Trees for Life are doing, and Trees for Life have been working very successfully on rewilding projects that are undertaken in collaboration with communities across Scotland. So it's when particularly the media are presenting rewilding as in opposition to local communities, I think that's a very unhelpful distinction. From our perspective, the obligations within the Land Rights Responsibility Statement and the community guidance on engagement with, the government guidance on engagement with communities and land use decision making applies to projects which are doing rewilding as much as they apply to any projects. And the expectation is that even if you're, regardless of what your objectives are as a landowner, you need to be engaging with local communities and working with local communities and taking their considerations into account. So we are working with a number of landowners who are undertaking rewilding focused projects in terms of how they can engage well and successfully with local communities. And I think it's what we probably need to do is actually start thinking about rewilding being something which can only be successfully achieved with local communities rather than presenting it as something which is in opposition to local communities. So I just think that's a really unhelpful way of framing it, and we're not going to find solutions to any of this when those two options are being presented in opposition to each other, because it's not actually the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Thanks, Megan. We're heading towards 8:30. Here's a sort of interesting question to try and close up from Elaine. Thank you, Elaine. The question is, all land ownership bad? Will farmland have to be given to communities? Let's just try and sort of just go around the three to close off. So let's just look forward, but take the question as a sort of catalyst, if you like. Let's look forward. What would good look like rolling forward? Lauren, I'm going to sort of put you right on the spot here. But what would a good pattern of land ownership look like in Scotland? We talk a lot about diversity of ownership, community ownership, responsibilities and rights, but what would a good pattern look like? Where would you like to be when you finally pop your clogs?
Right. I think there is a need for greater diversity of land ownership in Scotland. The last kind of published figures talked about 430 individuals and groups owning 50% of the private land in Scotland. I don't think that's acceptable in the longer term. I think we want greater private ownership of land, more people involved in private ownership. We would like to see more community land ownership. I think things like common good land, we would like to see that, perhaps more development being undertaken in relation to common good land. I think at the end of the day, though, we're not ideologically driven here. I think what we're wanting to see is more vibrant communities, increasing or at least retaining the population, particularly in our rural areas there. It's business growth. It's to have people who are wishing to undertake a commercial enterprise to have the availability of land to actually undertake their development. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment, certainly in terms of protocols, I would like to see them having a legislative underpinning so that we can encourage better behaviour from a wide range of landowners where that has been falling down. So I think that's the kind of picture I would like to see. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Lauren. Megan, what would you like to see? You've probably got a bit longer to go.
What are you saying, Andrew? What would I like to see? I mean, I think the reality is we are facing a number of very significant problems at the moment. We have the COVID pandemic, we have the climate emergency, we have the fact that our government and our local authorities are increasingly squeezed in terms of financial constraints. These all make a very, very difficult context. But I think for me, what good looks like and what good looks like for land reform is finding ways for us all to work together. And I think the ideas behind, for example, the Just Transition Commission and the concept of just transition is really at the core. It's about looking at the human rights framework, looking at environmental objectives, looking at the role that land ownership and land use can play within that, in terms of helping set a direction to help communities and landowners, or communities and landowners, find solutions to making the best and most productive use of that land and their own land in whichever way suits them the best. And I'm using the term productive in its broadest sense, not simply economically productive. But I think we have some choppy waters to navigate coming up. And I think it is important to try and make sure that we're at all times finding the balance between these various different asks of our land, because the pressures on land are really only going to increase in the coming years.
Great. And Megan, sorry, and Emma, your vision for where we want to get to.
Yeah, a healthy mix, I suppose, of public, private, community ownership. So the right kind of land is managed in the right kind of way, with the right people involved in the decision making for the land, which is not an easy thing to achieve, of course. But for me, it's not all about ownership of land. It's about how we collaborate over making decisions about land at a big scale and land at a small scale for our communities, so that we have we have better housing supply, we have the kind of houses that we need in the right places that we need it, and we have environments for our wildlife in the right kind of places that our wildlife needs that too. And we balance all of these things, and we're a productive country. We grow food, we have a healthy economy, and we achieve those kind of big Scottish Government aims using our land in the best way possible.
Thanks, Emma. That's great. One more question from Jamie, so I'm just going to answer it. Jamie, should local and national government provide leadership? Yes, I think I'm just going to say yes. From me, just to close this, where I think we need to get to, I don't think it's that difficult, actually. I think if you look across the North Sea to other countries, you will see countries where the electorate are much more at ease with the pattern of ownership and land use in their country. And ultimately, I think where we need to get to in Scotland is we need to get to a place where there is no longer a land question. We are comfortable, and those are for democratic processes, and no doubt land will be a big issue in this next election. But we need to get to a place where these just aren't big issues, that voters are basically comfortable with what's happening in their own country with their own land, and that is commonplace in many other parts of Europe. Okay, I said 8:30. I've strayed slightly over the line, and I apologize for that. I hope you found that useful. There is a website with vast amounts of information there. Please use it. There's also an email address, and please, I think it's probably yes, it's on the chat. Yes, if you go to the bottom of the chat, Jess or Sarah have just put it up. So it's info@landcommission.gov.sc. So if you've got other points or questions, including if you want to talk privately, because I absolutely recognize in a public meeting, I usually get 2 or 3 people wanting to talk privately, come in through the information thing and I'll give you a ring, or one of us will give you a ring. And please also read the stuff that's there. There's a huge amount there. We will continue to hold these public meetings once a month. We're trying to make them regional, because I think it's helpful, because issues do vary a bit. And if we're in the middle of Glasgow, it's slightly different to the Highlands. But we will continue to hold them once a month. And just as soon as we possibly can, we'll get back out around village halls, which is where I'd much rather be. Meantime, a big thank you to the 3 panel, to Emma, to Megan, to Lorne. A big thank you to you, to Jess and Sarah, who you can't see behind the scenes, but who have managed the whole thing very well. Thank you to you as well. It is great to have really good people helping to manage this process. But lastly, of course, just a massive thank you to all of you. I think I'm just going to check. Yeah, we had at one point 59 people. We're slightly down, 1 or 2 people have gone off because I've overrun. That's wonderful, and thank you for all the various comments. This is a hugely important subject for Scotland, for the people of Scotland, the economy of Scotland, for our children and our grandchildren. So please keep engaging with it. It will be a big issue in the election, and so on and so forth. But for now, thank you. Good night to you all. I won't say safe journey, because you don't have a safe journey, but we'll look forward to the next one of these. Thank you. Good night.